America. By Elliot Jaspin. Minutes after two black men were publicly executed in Forsyth County, Georgia, for the rape and murder of 18-year-old Mae Crow, a photographer apparently mounted the gallows and took this picture of the crowd. Although some blacks watched the hanging, lower right-hand corner, within a few weeks nearly every Negro had been driven from the county. Introduction. The story of how I found America's racial cleansings begins in an unlikely place, the small town of Berryville in northwest Arkansas. I was visiting there in 1998 and, with time on my hands, decided to tour a small history museum in the center of town. It was a quirky place. One room was devoted to antique embalming equipment, with all sorts of bric-a-brac piled on tables. As I wandered from room to room, a picture on one wall caught my eye. In the top of the frame was a photograph of a farmer and his wife taken some time before the Civil War. Below the picture was the farmer's will. On separate lines he carefully recounted his earthly possessions, parceling each out to family and friends. It was what you would expect until this line, wedged between livestock and land, were 5 slaves to be given away. A friend once described walking into a vault in the New Orleans courthouse and seeing stacks of old record books listing the slaves that each person owned. He stood there in horror. Before him was row after row of moldering books with their ghastly roll call. I understood the shock he tried to describe because it was what swept over me as I stared at that will. How do you describe an encounter with the artifacts of slavery? It is the corpse at the funeral. In it we see both our own loss and the loss of someone else. I stared at the will, and as the shock drained away, a question began to form. I had been in the area for several days. For the first time it occurred to me that, in all the time I had been there, I had not seen a single African American. Yet here in front of me was proof that at one time blacks had lived here. Were they still here? If not, when had they left and why? I walked out of the museum with the questions nagging me. Over the next few days as I drove to my different appointments, I kept searching for even one black face. Tourism was one of the pillars of the local economy, and the area was dotted with hotels, restaurants, and concert halls for country music fans. The people shopping in the stores were white. The people behind the counters were white. The people working in the motels were white. I began checking the people in cars as they passed. All white. On my last day, I finally asked the person I was interviewing if there were any blacks in the area. "Oh no," she said, "the Klan keeps them out." When I got back to Washington, D.C., I decided to take a closer look. Using 1990 census data I had downloaded from the internet, I sorted the information from Arkansas to see how many counties had a black population of less than 1%. I soon had a list that included about a third of all Arkansas counties. I thought that Arkansas, as a slaveholding state, would have a more even distribution of its black population. Perhaps I had been mistaken. I collected census data for other southern states: Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Texas. Each time I found some counties that were either all white or populated by so few blacks as to be virtually all white. This was not what I had expected. It was pure coincidence that, on one of the days that I was going over the census data in my office at Cox Newspapers in Washington, a woman from the Atlanta Bureau was visiting. As we chatted, I told her about the odd distribution of blacks in some southern states. She launched into a story about her brother, who was a cook. He had been recently hired as a chef in a restaurant in Forsyth County just outside of Atlanta. On the day she visited him there, she said the Klan was holding a rally on the courthouse lawn. She explained how all the blacks had been run out of the county around the turn of the century and had been kept out ever since. I went back to my census tables and found Forsyth County. In 1990, there were 12 blacks living in a county of over 40,000 people. It wasn't until several months later that I had the time to drive to the National Archives in Maryland and copy data from census books from the turn of the century. At night I would sit at the kitchen table and pore over the columns of numbers. I would compare counties from one census to another, looking for a sudden drop in the black population. Here and there I would see a strange gyration in the numbers. I had a gut feeling there was a pattern lurking in all these census tables, but the work was tedious and far too slow. There had to be a better way. While I would frequently go on the internet to find current census information, it had never occurred to me look there for census data from 50 or 100 years ago. But frustrated with hunting through paper records, I did a web search for historical census data. Almost immediately I found a database maintained by the University of Virginia. I began downloading census data from 1890 through 1930 for a small list of southern states. I then wrote a short computer program that would sort the data by state and county and compare the black population between each census. If there was a drop of 50% or greater between 2 decades, The data from that county would be saved in a separate file. I punched the enter key and in a matter of seconds the program had completed its work. I opened the new file I had created and began to scroll the list of counties where there had been a black population collapse. It was a moment of shock. Page after page of counties scrolled by. I had expected 4 or 5 counties, but I now had dozens. This could not be. I had made a mistake. I went back and checked the numbers. They were accurate. I downloaded data for more states from the University of Virginia and reran the program. The list grew. I started adding states outside the South, and the list grew even longer. What had happened? I made a list of 4 or 5 counties that seemed to be the most suspicious and went to the Library of Congress. By cross-checking my list with the New York Times index for the decade when each collapse occurred, I found the dates when there had been stories written about some of the counties. I mounted a microfilm reel and turned the crank. As I fiddled with the focus in the dark of the library's microfilm room, a headline appeared. All Negroes driven from Indiana town. The 7-paragraph story was to the point. Negroes began leaving this mining town early this afternoon, following the warning issued by white residents to be out of town by 7 o'clock tonight. I mounted another reel and found another story. Missouri mob's work, kills 3 Negroes, burns their homes and drives every Negro out of Pierce City. For nearly 15 hours, ending at noon today, this town of 3,000 people has been in the hands of a mob of armed whites, determined to drive every Negro from its precincts. I had found America's racial cleansings. Like an archipelago, the counties where racial cleansings occurred form a rough arc that begins in North Carolina, crosses the Appalachians, and extends into the Midwest. In some cases more than a century has passed since blacks were driven out of these counties, and yet they still remain islands inhabited almost exclusively by whites. People pass through such counties on interstate highways never guessing at their history. If they were to stop and ask about a racial cleansing, it is likely they would be met with blank stares. History is what we choose to remember. But anyone who carefully digs through the history of these islands will often find the evidence of these long-ago eruptions. These were not small, discrete events. The racial cleansing that struck Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912, for example, engulfed at least a half-dozen surrounding counties in northern Georgia before it burned itself out in 1913. Because Forsyth County was the epicenter, the blacks there sustained the worst losses. More than 1,000 people, 97% of the county's black population, were driven out over a period of about 2 months. They owned 1,900 acres of farmland, nearly all of which they were forced to sell or abandon. The county's 5 black churches were burned. As the frenzy spread, whites in adjacent counties began ordering their black neighbors to leave. The numerical losses in Jackson County were the largest. The black population there dropped by 1,600, a loss of 19%. Whites in Dawson County forced every one of its 152 blacks to go. In other counties like Hall, Cobb, and Cherokee there were smaller but still substantial drops in the black community. Racial cleansings occurred across the nation. They occurred in the North and Midwest as well as the South. The dozen cases described in this book took place in 8 states including 2 in Indiana and 1 in Missouri. In this book I focus specifically on racial cleansings that emptied entire counties, but there are many more cases where whites ordered blacks to vacate towns or villages. Typically the accounts of these racial cleansings are found as brief items in the back pages of old newspapers. The New York Times ran a 2-paragraph story from Dothan, Alabama in 1912 that began, after wreaking vengeance on the Negro population of Dixie, a small town near here, driving every black from the village and killing one last night, a mob is searching the countryside for another Negro. According to another story in an Ohio newspaper from 1919, Columbus is sheltering many Negroes who made a precipitous exodus from Marion Monday evening following the posting of warnings for them to leave the city. Occasionally the account of a racial cleansing will appear in an oral history. A school teacher in Garrett, Kentucky, reminiscing about the town's past, said that, after a local sheriff was killed by a black, the townspeople got on every side of the hollow with high-powered rifles and just riddled the black houses. The next morning there wasn't a colored person in Garrett. These racial cleansings in rural towns and villages were so common that I would stumble across them just by leafing through old newspapers. But the tools to do a systematic search still do not exist. Census data that would point to sudden population drops is only computerized on the county level, a limitation that shaped my own research. But as more and more old census data is computerized, the list of racial cleansings is bound to grow exponentially. By just searching for counties where there was a drop of 50% or greater in the black population, I found 260 suspect sites. Because I limited the search to 31 states in the South, Midwest, and Mid-Atlantic where I thought I would be most likely to find racial cleansings, the search took in about 2,500 of the approximately 3,100 counties in the United States. While it is unlikely that there were racial cleansings in all 260 counties, the number of places to research was overwhelming. But that number pales in comparison with the possibility of looking at the census data for the approximately 18,000 towns and villages in the United States. If, as with the counties, about 10% are suspect, the list of places will grow to 1,800. Even that number is probably understated. Driving people out of a town is far easier than driving them out of a county. There is another indication of just how common these expulsions were. To make sure the examples of racial cleansings used in this book were as unambiguous as possible, I selected only those that were the worst of the worst. I applied 4 criteria in selecting the cases for this book. The cleansing had to be countywide, it had to occur suddenly, taking a few months at most, it had to be documented through some kind of contemporary account, and, most important, it had to have been successful. To be successful, the number of blacks living in a county today had to be less than it was before the cleansing occurred. This standard represents a particularly high bar because it does not take into account population growth over the last 100 years. At the time that the approximately 1,000 blacks were driven out of Forsyth County, for example, its total population was about 12,000. Nearly a century later, the county has grown to 98,000 people, but there are only 684 blacks living there, and most of those have settled along the county's border. The same is true of the other counties represented in this book. The populations in counties with successful racial cleansings are less than 1% black as of the most recent census. In 7 of the counties there are fewer than 50 black residents. In other words, these counties remain white preserves. Despite these stringent criteria, I was able to document a dozen such cleansings. In addition to being numerous, possibly even common, what is striking about racial cleansings is that they were unlike the all too familiar lynchings or race riots. While people were lynched during some racial cleansings, there were expulsions where no one was killed. And, although the threat of violence always hung in the air, there were racial cleansings, unlike race riots, where no one was attacked. What sets a racial cleansing apart from other kinds of violence against blacks is its intent. In every case, whites would deliver an ultimatum: leave by some deadline or die. Afterwards, residents might post signs telling blacks not to enter a town or county, so-called sundown towns, but that was not always necessary. The reputation these places earned because of a racial cleansing was often enough notice. However their whiteness was enforced, it has been an enduring legacy. These counties remain the holes in America's racial map. While Forsyth County has 684 blacks, neighboring Fulton County, which experienced lynchings and race riots but never a cleansing, has a black population of 363,000. In Marshall County, Kentucky, where a racial cleansing took place in 1908, there are only 37 blacks. Next door in Graves County, the black population is 1,600. In Unicoi County, Tennessee, there are 12 blacks compared with more than 4,000 in adjacent Washington County. The paradox of these counties is that while the fear remains, the histories are missing. Although blacks will warn one another that a particular town or county is dangerous, they will often have no idea of what happened there. By the same token, people who live in a county where there was a racial cleansing usually think their history is unique. They are unaware of numerous other racial cleansings across the United States. It is as if racial cleansings are a blank space in America's memory. The vast majority of Americans have no knowledge of the nation's racial cleansings. They are so little known that when the 1923 destruction of the black community in Rosewood, Florida came to light in the 1980s, the public was astonished. The state formed a commission to investigate. Officials sought out survivors. The Florida legislature voted to make reparations. Hollywood made a movie about the event. It was treated as something unique. Unfortunately, it was far from unusual. What was unusual was that the history of Rosewood was resurrected. This book then is intended to begin the process of reconstructing and understanding what happened. Concentrating on 12 of the very worst racial cleansings throws this history into stark relief. Through these detailed accounts I also hope to give the reader a sense of what it was like for both whites and blacks to live through an expulsion. While all expulsions have their similarities, they also echo what Tolstoy said of families: all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Each cleansing was unique in its origins. Whites feared that ex-slaves would become citizens. They feared blacks were a danger to the community. They worried that blacks would take jobs. In one case it was done supposedly to find a child molester. In some towns, whites opposed these expulsions, and there are accounts of white men fighting one another in the street. Other communities looked back on their racial cleansing with pride. In the end, these were justifications for a cleansing rather than their cause. Blacks were targets for a cleansing because, while they lived in a community, they usually did not belong to the place where they lived. The mark of citizenship is the right to vote, and that right was largely denied to blacks. Worse still, segregation widened the gulf between blacks and the community they lived in. Once whites walled off blacks, the lack of normal social contact gave rise to increasingly bizarre fantasies. Whites worried that armies of blacks were forming in the night waiting for the right moment to pounce. Even if they did not attack in groups, their bite was poisonous and they had unrestrained sexual appetites. The only reason for risking the presence of blacks in a community was economic necessity. Who else would pick crops or wash clothes? But black labor was a double-edged sword. Blacks represented a very real economic threat to the white working man. When business interests were not training blacks to compete with whites, they were hiring them as strikebreakers. If some pretext could be found, a rape or murder, white laborers would benefit by driving off their black competitors. As this history is resurrected, we are always left to grapple with the legacy of pain. Victims of the expulsion describe an abiding sense of shame. After a farmer was driven out of Forsyth County, he would forever after tell people he was from Chicago. For others, the shame comes from a sense of helplessness. Black men, who would have liked to defend their homes, instead bowed to the inevitable. In flight there was safety, but it was also emasculating. The children and grandchildren of the victims talk about their fear and anger. The counties where racial cleansings took place loom large in black folklore. They are seen, and often for good reason, as dangerous places. Again and again as I interviewed people for this book, I heard about the speech. It was the talk that black parents gave their children about where it was safe to go and where it was not, and what to do when, inevitably, you were stopped by the police. At the heart of the speech was a memory of some place that had driven out its black population. The details of what happened are often sketchy or even non-existent, but the terror endures. The result is that for blacks the country exists as a checkerboard with some squares that are safe and others that are not. For whites, the memory of racial cleansings is, if anything, even trickier. At the time that these expulsions occurred, whites often applauded what had been done. As one Chamber of Commerce proudly noted in its marketing brochure, the town did not have mosquitoes or Negroes. Today, when catchphrases like multiculturalism and racial diversity are national goals, that history makes whites uneasy. Faced with an inconvenient history, the first defense is silence. The official historian in one county acknowledged that something terrible had happened in her area but refused to discuss it because it would only cause trouble. When Murray Bishop, the editor of the Monett Times, wrote a series of stories in the 1990s about the racial cleansing in his Missouri county, it was the first time it had been discussed publicly in more than 90 years. Some newspaper editors decided that the less said the better. When blacks were forced to leave Sharp County, Arkansas in 1906, the editor of a paper there declared, "The record does not know who is responsible for this exodus among the Negroes. We have no desire to know." Even when a racial cleansing is mentioned, it is often cloaked in some euphemism. A local historian, trying to account for a racial cleansing that involved 3 murders, the burning of black-owned homes, and a military-style assault on the black quarter by more than 1,000 men, only told readers that blacks left after a disturbing situation. When silence fails, the second defense is to blame someone else. The easiest targets are those who were driven out. After Bishop published his history of the Pierce City racial cleansing, a reader objected in a letter to the editor. "Don't be deceived into thinking the black populace was totally innocent and totally law-abiding, being jumped on unaware by a bunch of bigots. The problem," the writer noted, "was that there was reputed law-breaking by Negroes leading up to the mob action." Comanche County, Texas put a slightly different spin on its expulsion. There had been 2 separate incidents where blacks had murdered whites, and whites used them as the justification for the racial cleansing. In its retelling, about 20 years after the event, the whites were being generous by only forcing all blacks to flee. It may be supposed that this has grown out of unreasonable prejudice and without just cause, but it finds its origin in 2 terrible tragedies so atrocious and coming so near together that the forbearance of the people was manifest by a sentence so mild as banishment. A third defense is to simply deny that the racial cleansing ever occurred. When Forsyth County was thrust onto the national stage in 1987, one resident explained on national television that, "I understand, blacks weren't run out. I understand that they left over a period of time." The Atlanta Journal-Constitution echoed that revisionism when it ran a page-1 story during the same period arguing that the expulsion was a legend because not every single black left. That article was followed by a local historian's study arguing against black reparations claims on the grounds that Forsyth County blacks had somehow managed to sell their land as they were being run out of town by a deadly mob. Picking up on the study, the Forsyth County Historical Society declared in a book it published in 2002, decades-old rumors to the contrary, each and every parcel of land was sold, with the proceeds going to the African American owners. In fact, these denials mask an economic reality. The land that Forsyth County blacks were forced to abandon has today become very valuable. Rather than deal with the thorny issue of compensation, it is far easier to pretend that blacks have no claim. Even when whites acknowledge that their forebears may have stolen black-owned land, they angrily dismiss the idea that anyone today should be forced to compensate the descendants. Those who own the land today clearly are blameless. But they also deny that the government, which, at best, did nothing while its black citizens were being robbed and persecuted, should finally be held to account. That a community feels a need to either deny or shade its history is a measure of just how powerful these racial cleansings remain. In part, townspeople may want to edit the past as a way to protect the memories of their fathers and grandfathers who took part in these expulsions. But by shading what happened, they are also protecting the legacy of these cleansings. Through a variety of devices, these communities continue the project their ancestors began, an all-white society, even though the rest of the country has moved on. By denying what took place long ago, they can claim that their racially pure world is a coincidence. In fact, it is not. Over the last century, a variety of different tactics have been used to enforce the color line in these counties. Sometimes a county's reputation has been enough to keep blacks away. When that failed, the record shows that after a cleansing there was a long history of threats and intimidation. When threats failed, force was used. What permits this to continue is not the denial and hostility in these communities. It is that the wider world has chosen to remain silent, to maintain these racial cleansings as America's family secret. The silence surrounding these cleansings has had another, unintended consequence. It has robbed these communities of the example of those people who, in a time of great moral crisis, acted heroically. In nearly every racial cleansing there were whites who opposed what was happening. Towns like Cumming, Georgia, and Comanche, Texas, held mass meetings and passed resolutions condemning the expulsions. White employers in Harrison, Arkansas sheltered their black employees. Newspaper editors in Texas and Kentucky denounced the expulsions. A railroad superintendent in Tennessee faced down a mob that was ordering the blacks to leave. A judge in Kentucky almost single-handedly fought the vigilantes to a standstill. This tradition of resistance continues to this day. Over the past decade, mostly local historians or reporters in a few of the counties where there were racial cleansings have begun to investigate what happened. Murray Bishop, unmoved by complaints of townspeople, wrote a series of stories and later dedicated a plaque to the memory of those killed by the mob in the Lawrence County racial cleansing. In Forsyth County, Don Shadburn, the county historian, has produced a thoughtful and carefully researched account of his county's racial unrest. And in Harrison, Arkansas, newspaper reporter George Holcomb has written a series of stories describing the community's racist past. But as encouraging as these efforts are, the fact remains that we are a nation with two histories, one white, one black. In our day-to-day lives, this may not be very important. But in times of crisis, our divided history exerts its hold on the national debate. At those moments, because they see the world in such different ways, whites and blacks find themselves talking past one another. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, black objections to the word refugee seem overly sensitive, even eccentric, to whites. When the poor in New Orleans, who are overwhelming black, are left to their own devices while the city is being evacuated, whites talk about a class problem. Blacks, with long and painful memories of being outcasts, decry what they see as yet another example of racism. The same is true when it comes to the debate over reparations. Whites, with almost no memory of racial cleansings, see reparations claims as a not-so-subtle attempt by blacks to get a handout. Blacks, who remember how their families lost all they owned in an expulsion, wonder why they cannot get justice. The list is almost endless because, as unsettling as it may be, Americans do not share a common history. The problem grows more complicated when we talk about racial cleansings. Even when they are acknowledged, people stumble over how to talk about them. What words should we use to describe what we know? To worry about semantics may seem pedantic, but language is how we understand things. It is no coincidence that people use euphemisms such as disturbing situations to describe, or perhaps more accurately to disguise, what was occurring. And as we now try to uncover what took place, classifying what we see before us is a vital step in restoring our history. In the few surviving accounts, The expulsions are described by the physical act that was occurring. In 1908, for example, Ray St. Leonard Baker, a crusading white journalist who wrote a prescient series of stories on race relations in his book Following the Color Line, discussed how whites would terrorize their black neighbors into leaving a community. He called what he saw driving out Negroes. Others have used terms like banishment, forced to flee, or expulsions. The problem with these phrases is that they describe only the act, not the policy. Nazis murdered Jews, but what was going on was not just murder. It was genocide, the policy of killing a whole class of people. To say that Nazis murdered Jews without also saying they were conducting a campaign of genocide is to miss the point of what was happening. And yet the word genocide did not exist when Hitler began his mass killings. It was invented by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin in 1943 and was ultimately used during the Nuremberg trials to punish Nazi crimes, not prevent them. Words and terms are born out of a need to describe the world. But because the victors, who get to write the history, had little need to describe the fate of the conquered, the words did not exist soon enough to describe and ultimately prevent the wholesale destruction of black communities in America. In 1991, however, the information revolution allowed victims of similar expulsions a chance to write their own history. It was during that summer that the Serb-dominated Yugoslav Federal Army marched through a large swath of Croatia, sending thousands of Croatian refugees fleeing in terror. In a press conference, the beleaguered Croatian government accused the Serbians of ethnic cleansing of the critical areas that are to be annexed to Serbia. Within a year, the term ethnic cleansing was in almost daily use. But while it was used widely, it was not defined. In one sense, events defined it. The daily reports of killings and rapes, the streams of refugees, and the bland denials of any wrongdoing described ethnic cleansing in a very graphic way. But it was left to the United Nations to give it a more formal definition. Ethnic cleansing, the UN decided, was the elimination by the ethnic group exerting control over a given territory of members of other ethnic groups. If it were not for the fact that the term was coined by its victims, it would be especially unpalatable. The idea of cleansing brings to mind the idea of purifying. And as one critic has noted, there is nothing pure about driving innocent people from their homes. As it is, the term, because of its origins, has a sardonic ring to it. But sardonic or not, it gives us a way to describe what we see and know. These, then, are the stories of America's racial cleansings.